In 1940, it would not be an exaggeration to say that the world was saved by 2 aircraft designs and a handful of pilots. As the crushing tide of Nazism crested on the banks of the French coastline that summer, England stood alone, its allies plundered and destroyed. The Germans had won easy victories everywhere, from Poland in 1939 to the conquest of France in only 40 days a year later. Germany and its mighty blitzkrieg war machine now stood poised to conquer all of Europe. All that barred their path to total victory was the English Channel and what was left of RAF Fighter Command. With its 49 squadrons of Hawker Hurricanes and Supermarine Spitfires, Fighter Command would prove to be Britain's last line of defense that summer of 1940. Those 2 aircraft, the ones which would soon save England and change the course of World War II, were pre-war designs dating back to the mid-1930s. The Hawker Hurricane first flew in November of 1935 as the Royal Air Force's first monoplane fighter. Faster than any RAF airplane of the day, the Hurricane prototype exceeded 300 miles per hour in level flight. 2 years later, the Hurricane 1 entered service. Pilots quickly learned to love the new plane, both for its ruggedness and its maneuverability.
The Hurricane was a better gun platform. It was a steadier aircraft when the guns were firing than the Spitfire was. And it was a very stable aircraft, considerably slower than the Spitfire. But it flew well. It was comfortable to fly.
I thought it was a wonderful aircraft. It was gentle to fly, beautiful aircraft. So, very responsive to the controls. And it was the earliest aircraft to be in the Battle of Britain. In fact, most of the Battle of Britain, you hear, like in films and that it was mainly done by Spitfires, but it was mainly Hurricanes because there were more of them. The Hurricane was just an ideal, like a gentleman's aircraft.
At the same time, however, a new aircraft was joining operational squadrons. This was the Supermarine Spitfire, destined to be one of the war's greatest designs.
People think of the Spitfire and the Hurricane as being in the same generation. They actually not. The Spitfire is really a generation more modern, in a way, a generation more modern than the Hurricane, although they both use the same engine. But the Hurricane was from the tube and fabric type aircraft, following the previous designs of biplanes by the same designer, whereas the Spitfire was into the all-metal monocoque aircraft, higher performance, very maneuverable. It was very versatile. Bubble-top Spitfires, long-wing Spitfires, short-wing Spitfires. It went through a series of upgrades. It went to the Griffin engine. The speed went up. Everything went up. The Spitfire had a lot of growth to it, and it was an excellent fighter.
Wonderful. It got the height, the speed, a little more speed, and the height. Beautiful 2-stage. Stanley Hooker designed it, Rolls-Royce. Beautiful thing. 2-speed, 2-stage supercharger. And so all the Spitfire needed was that. And see, it could turn inside both of them with ease. Couldn't roll with a 190, nothing could. The 190 was the best roller in the world, but it only rolled so far.
In the air, it was a marvelous airplane. It was beautifully stable. It was very light on controls. It had the standard wing version that I flew had a very favorable stall. It wasn't at all dangerous. And it was a very comfortable airplane to fly.
You don't fly a Spitfire, you wear it. And it's just so comfy and so small and so neat and so compact. It's just a lovely little airplane.
I dearly love the Spitfire. Ask me what I thought of it to fly. It was sheer poetry, just sheer poetry. Terrible on the ground, horrible brakes, but once you got them in the air, it was like flying a poem.
By 1940, both the Hurricane and the Spitfire were in full production, just in time for the Battle of Britain, and their epic moment in the sun, where these two aircraft types and their pilots would play David to the Luftwaffe's daunting Goliath. While the Hurricanes and Spitfires of Fighter Command managed to hold off the Luftwaffe during the pivotal years between 1940 and 1942, a newer generation of fighters and fighter bombers were needed to strike back and take the offensive. The Hurricane was pressed into service as a fighter bomber in early 1941. With its massive firepower of 8 machine guns or 4 cannon, it was well suited for the role. But by 1942, the Hurricane was showing its age. Clearly, a new fighter bomber would be needed. 41. Big and powerful, the Typhoon was initially used as an air superiority fighter, much in the manner of the Spitfire.
Everybody thought the Typhoon was a fighter aircraft. No, it really wasn't. It couldn't turn inside of anything very much. It had its best performance, I think it was 10 or 14,000. At 28,000, you're just barely hanging on. So it really wasn't fit for sweeps.
Hawker Company put out the Typhoon, and that was supposed to be a fighter aircraft, and it could have been, except that it wouldn't perform at altitude where the other aircraft, the fighter aircraft, were. So it was reassessed as a ground-level fighter.
In this role, the new aircraft shined. Down low, the Typhoon was faster than anything the Luftwaffe could pit against it.
I know that I went through the air in sometime spring of 42, maybe it was May of 42, at 422 miles an hour, which is a hell of a speed. Now that's faster than, I think that was the fastest airplane in the world at that time.
By 1944, it had become the best British close air support weapon of the war.
I just thought it was the most wonderful aircraft ever. It was fast, it was big and tough, and delivered a terrific lot of, ammo too. But it was a wonderful airplane, and it was, as far as I was concerned, trustworthy.
Another fighter bomber produced during the war was the Bristol Beaufighter. It soon demonstrated that its versatility made it one of the best all-round planes of its day.
It was the most heavily armed aircraft in World War II. Their side or our side. It had 4 cannons under the pilot's seat firing forward. They carried 8 rockets. It had 6 machine guns in the wing. And it had 1 firing backwards at the back, and could carry a torpedo or bombs also.
While the Beaufighter earned its fame by being a jack of all trades, it was a master of none. But it was good enough to get the job done until other more specialized aircraft arrived on the scene. In 1942, a new weapon joined the campaign. This was the de Havilland Mosquito, one of the war's most unusual designs.
Government threw a lot of cold water on it first because it was built of wood, mainly because it was a non-strategic metal, plus the fact that it was a traditional way that de Havilland had built some of their airliners and racers. Almost every role they used it in: photo reconnaissance, bombing, fighters, night fighters. It was an excellent aircraft. Had good range, good speed. I mean, it didn't need to be defended because it was faster than most of the things that were chasing it.
The Mosquito was a fantastic airplane, as I think anybody that flew it or flew in it would say, without a doubt. I feel very privileged to have been able to fly one.
The Mosquito aircraft, it's been said that it's been the most versatile of all military aircraft that have ever been built. It was used as a night fighter. It was used as a naval patrol plane, hunting submarines. They put a 57 millimeter cannon on board it for for sinking submarines. They used it for bombers. It was the most successful bomber built during the war years. It raided Berlin 170 times during the war years, and that is in squadron strength. It carried a 4,000-pound, it's only little aircraft, and yet it carried a 4,000-pound bomb all the way to Berlin, which is more, Americans couldn't carry 4,000 to Berlin with their fortresses.
Armed with cannon and machine guns in the nose and underside of the fuselage, the Mosquito proved to be a deadly fighter platform, thanks to its amazing agility and 400-mile-per-hour top speed. In fact, the Germans were unable to produce an aircraft fast enough to catch the Mosquito until the advent of the jet-propelled Messerschmitt 262. Few planes had such a dramatic effect on the war effort. And for the Mosquito crews, their legacy will be one of success and victory. It had been a long, hard war for the RAF, but thanks to the excellent aircraft its pilots flew, Britain was able to stand against the Luftwaffe and push forward to final victory, shoulder to shoulder with the United States Army Air Force. They came home shot full of holes too numerous to count, with chunks of engine missing and hydraulic fluid bleeding through gaping tears in their aluminum skin. Love them or hate them, nobody's ever questioned the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt's ability to bring a pilot back safely.
It absorbed, as I said, a tremendous amount of damage and would still fly. The inline engine wouldn't absorb anything. The radial engine, you know, we had cases of people losing several cylinders and still coming back.
They would really take, like I said, really take a beating from being shot up or anything, more than any other aircraft. They were really a tough bird.
There was one case when I was waiting for takeoff and a plane came in and landed, and it had been hit in the engine, and one piston was flipping up and down in the air, and the other piston was gone, and the plane flew in and landed, and the guy pulled off the runway. He didn't tax it, and he got out.
47 was a great airplane for that. It absorbed tremendous damage and still fly. The group commander took it through a tree. Literally, the aircraft went through. The tree was the loser, and the wings didn't come off. But he just forgot what he was flying and what altitude he was at, and went through a pretty large tree. Lots of damage, structural damage on the wings, but the aircraft came home. I don't think that I know a 51 wouldn't have done it. I don't think a 40 or I don't think a 38 would have done it. So it was that kind of an aircraft.
I had dropped my bomb, done my job. I headed home. I get back and I land, and people are running alongside the aircraft pointing at it as I taxied. And I lean out and look, and the whole side is covered with oil. And when I got out, I got a hole a foot big in the engine and 2 cylinders missing. But it ran fine.
For 2 critical years, the P-47 Thunderbolt served as the backbone of the U.S. Army Air Force's fighter force, battling on every front in every conceivable climate and terrain. The P-47 played a major role in the defeat of the Luftwaffe in the skies of Europe. Yet since the end of World War II, the P-47 has been overshadowed by the fame and glamour of the Lockheed P-38 and North American P-51 Mustang. By war's end, over 15,600 P-47s had been produced, more than any other American aircraft save the consolidated B-24 Liberator. Even today, the P-47 Thunderbolt inspires intense emotions amongst the pilots assigned to fly it. After sharing the air with a 47, a pilot either came back a devoted convert or appalled that Republic ever designed such a monstrous fighter.
When I took my training, I took it at Bradley Field in Connecticut, and there were P-40 pilots that were there, and they didn't fly with you, and all they did was check you out, and they weren't really too enthused with the P-47. So when I went overseas, I did not want to fly the P-47. I wanted to get out of the 38s or 51s. And when I got to this base, a P-47 came over there, and he went across that base. He pulled up and did one roll, and we just were in awe, you know. My God, that thing will fly. And I went from 1 inch tall to 10 foot tall.
It was a great experience looking back on it, flying the 47. It was a very forgiving aircraft, and the work that we flew it, used it for, was great. But, you know, it's like anything. A driver of a car, airplane drivers are the same way. You fall in love with something, and you don't want to trade. You don't want to get rid of the things. And, you know, we weren't smart enough to know that, well, it's probably going to save your life many more times than the 38 might, because it's not as vulnerable as an inline engine aircraft, whether it's a 40, 51, or 38, but it still was not my first love by any means.
In 1939, the Army Air Force issued a request for a high-altitude fighter that could use the new turbo supercharger that Boeing had developed for the B-17 heavy bomber. Such an installation on a fighter would require the plane to be huge indeed, but that didn't deter Republic. After studying the Army Air Force's requirements, the company's chief designer quipped, "It'll be a dinosaur, but a dinosaur with good proportions."
Because of the Army's specifications on this new fighter, Republic chose to design the P-47 around two main features. The first was a brand new engine called the Pratt & Whitney R2800, which was an 18-cylinder radial engine. It was just monstrous, and it provided 2,000 horsepower, which was far more than most any other engine of its day. So it was a very revolutionary engine. The other thing that they needed to design around was the fact that the turbo supercharger took up a lot of space. So the reason why the fuselage for the P-47 is so deep is because of the fact that the engine was so enormous to begin with, and the ductwork and all the accoutrements for the turbo supercharger required a massive amount of space.
Dubbed the XP-47B, the new fighter possessed enormous gait. As it sat on its wide, long landing gear, it reminded some of a giant milk jug on wheels. As a result, throughout the war, pilots and ground crew rarely referred to the P-47 as anything other than the jug. Though it weighed over 5 tons, the XP-47 could reach speeds over 400 miles per hour. In fact, at altitude, it was the fastest fighter ever built for the Army Air Force up to that time. Tests also showed that the P-47 was an excellent formation aircraft.
The 47, when you pulled the power on it, that huge nose out there was like running into a haystack, suddenly equipped. It was easy to fly formation because 38, you'd come in and overrun everybody. That's the first thing that we all learned when we had inline engine. You want to slow down early and sneak up on your flight leader. But on the 47, it was a beautiful airplane for flying close, very close. We trapped our flight leader one time. Two of us coming up the Irrawaddy River ran into the overlapping wings, and he would go like this, you know. But you wouldn't dare do that in an aircraft that wouldn't stop or start as quickly as a 47.
With a wingspan of 40 feet, a length of 36 feet, and sitting 15 feet off the ground, the P-47 was simply huge. Its broad wing gave it tremendous agility at heights other aircraft could hardly maneuver in effectively. Some converts were made right there. Fast and brutish looking, the P-47 was the type of plane that looked like it could get into a toe-to-toe fight, take a beating, but always come out on top. and it could dish out far deadlier punishment than any other World War II fighter. With 8 .50 caliber machine guns, the Thunderbolt's firepower was truly awesome.
I strafed trains one day and tipped a boxcar over on its side, not exploded, just tipped it over from the impact. So tremendous firepower on those 850.
Toward the end of the summer of 1943, the P-47C was gradually replaced by the D model. Initially, little distinguished the two versions.
Prior to the fall of 1943, the P-47, including the D version, had really not proven itself to be effective as an escort fighter for the 8th Air Force. And the major problem was that they had this fuel guzzling engine and it limited their range so that they were unable to provide cover for the bombers into the main targets inside Germany. And this problem really isn't resolved until the P-47 D-15 model arrives in England. And this model has the ability to put wing tanks underneath each of the wings. Each of those wing tanks is 108 gallons. And that gives the P-47 D-15 the extra range it needs to begin to be effective as an escort fighter for the heavy bomber force.
The Thunderbolt now had almost twice the amount of fuel of earlier versions. P-47s soon appeared over Germany, within 150 miles of Berlin, wreaking havoc wherever they went. By the spring of 1944, the Thunderbolt had come into its own as a high-altitude escort fighter. Yet just as it reached its zenith, it was eclipsed by the longer-legged P-51 Mustang. As the P-47's role as an escort fighter was eclipsed by the P-51, so grew its role as a ground attack weapon. 9th Air Force P-47s played a tremendously important role from D-Day through the end of the war, supporting the ground troops as they pushed forward into the Reich. From their aerial perches, Thunderbolt pilots searched out any targets of opportunity. Tanks were prime targets for the roving bands of Thunderbolt pilots. During the Battle of the Bulge, the P-47 squadrons helped blunt the German attack on those few days when the weather cleared enough to get planes aloft. By war's end, Thunderbolt units had destroyed more targets than any other British or American fighter bomber. Tens of thousands of trucks, hundreds of tanks, thousands of aircraft, troops, and tons of supplies went up in flames as a result of marauding P-47 attacks. No other aircraft packed this devastating a punch, and nothing in the air could take the amount of ground fire and get its pilot home as could the beloved P-47 Thunderbolt. When the world celebrated VE Day, the JUG pilots in the 8th, 12th, 15th, and 9th Air Forces could look back with pride on their accomplishments, knowing that they played a significant role in defeating the Nazi war machine. Fast and sleek, looking every inch the thoroughbred fighter it was, the North American P-51 Mustang rose from obscurity to carve out a unique place in aviation history. Loved by its pilots, feared by its enemies, the Mustang possessed a rare blend of speed, agility, and range that made it an unbeatable air-to-air fighter.
Pilot's airplane, a real comfortable pilot's airplane. Very honest, no bad habits, no bad tendencies, great performance, lots of armament, lots of gas, lots of fuel. It was a superior airplane in performance all around. I think it was the airplane of the war on any side.
They were a beautiful airplane to fly. And I could sit there and reach all the switches and everything. I didn't have to get a bunch of pillows or anything. I could move the seats up and fly it, and really was a easy airplane to fly.
I don't know how to describe it. As I said, they were very responsive. You felt you could outfly anything. It was an easy plane to take off, to land. It was very maneuverable. You could brake right or left almost with equal ease.
It had more power, more maneuverability, more speed, more climb. It probably was better than anything the Germans had by 2%. Within a lot of dogfights where I was very happy with my 2%.
When the Mustang appeared in the skies over Europe, the United States Army Air Force pilots finally had the ability to carry the fight to the Luftwaffe over Nazi Germany itself. And while the German Focke-Wulf 190 and Messerschmitt 109 outclassed earlier American fighters, the P-51 outperformed them both. Though today the Mustang is considered to be one of the greatest American fighters ever built, oddly enough, it began its career as a reconnaissance aircraft flown not by the United States, but by Britain's Royal Air Force. It would take almost 4 years for the Mustang to evolve into a war winner. 4 years that started with an odd request and an impossible deadline in the darkest days of World War II.
At the time in 1940, the British were utterly desperate for anything that could be a combat-ready fighter, so they were going all over the United States looking for anything that they could purchase. When North American made their proposal, the Brits actually snapped at the opportunity. They just went for it because they needed aircraft quickly, and North American was promising delivery of the prototype within 100 days or so, and they were promising an aircraft better than the P-40, and they needed something better than the Tomahawk. And in fact, North American did exactly what they promised. In 117 days, they had the prototype of the P-51 Mustang, which was called the NA-73, constructed, and within 130 days, that prototype flew for the first time.
The Royal Air Force soon took delivery of about 600 of the new North American fighters, which they dubbed the Mustang 1. British pilots soon discovered they had a terrific low-level aircraft on their hands. With a top speed of almost 390 miles per hour on the deck, the Mustang 1 was probably the fastest American fighter of its day. Light on the controls, very agile, and capable of climbing at over 3,000 feet a minute, the Mustang looked like a real winner. While the British found the Mustang very useful in Western Europe, at first the United States Army Air Force had little interest in the new fighter. It took some time before the Americans could be won over by the glowing reports coming back from the RAF on the Mustang's combat record. Almost reluctantly, the USAAF ordered a small number of Mustangs, dubbed the P-51A, and sent them to observation and tactical reconnaissance squadrons. Unfortunately, the Allison engine and its lack of a supercharger continued to limit the plane's high-level performance. But just as it appeared the Mustang would be relegated to minor roles in the air war, a few men came up with a brilliant idea that would transform the P-51 into the most effective air superiority fighter history has ever seen.
There was a British pilot by the name of Harker who got the idea of taking a Mustang 1 airframe and mating it with a British Merlin engine. And he proposed this to a U.S. Air Force, Army Air Force colonel by the name of Hitchcock, who agreed that this might be a worthy thing to do. So they went off and they got approval for this, and they took a Merlin engine, put it into a Mustang, and discovered that they had a thoroughbred fighter with excellent high-altitude capability. The Merlin was being produced in the United States at the time by Packard, and so pretty soon the approval was given to produce the Mustang with the Packard-built Merlin engine, and that became the P-51B, the first true strategic fighter of World War II.
The British engine that Packard built was extremely reliable. It was a great engine, lots of power, and altitude performance. Had a two-stage, two-speed supercharger that let it get to high altitude. So it was a superior performer in every way.
With a top speed of almost 450 miles per hour at high altitude, the Merlin-powered Mustang now had the engine needed to carry the fight to the Luftwaffe as an air-to-air fighter. With additional long-range drop tanks, the Mustangs soon proved they could fly for up to 8 hours. That meant the P-51 could range over the farthest reaches of Nazi Germany and still return to bases in England. As more P-51Bs arrived in England, the 8th Air Force began to convert its P-47 groups. In January, only about 50 P-51s were combat-ready to escort the bombers over Germany. By April, however, almost 400 were available, and some of the hottest squadrons in England were now equipped with the revolutionary fighter.
In the early part of the war, before the Mustangs came in, they couldn't get escort beyond a certain point. The 47s and 38s could only take them part way, and then they had to go back. And when our group came, we could take them clear into target and pick them back up on the other side. So, of course, there were only a handful of us initially, and but we were able to help them a little bit. Later, of course, 51s were all over the place. We used to watch them in prison camp, and when they'd go over, and it looked like each bomber had their own 51 escort with them.
The P-51s were the workhorses. There were so many more P-51s because their range was farther, and I think their maneuverability was better. They were our little buddies. They didn't have much use for us. They didn't understand what it was like to drive a truck.
As the number of Mustangs in Europe increased, the Luftwaffe's losses skyrocketed. Through the spring of 1944, the German Air Force lost between 10 and 30% of its fighter pilots each month. While the Luftwaffe always had planes on hand, by the summer of 1944, it faced a pilot shortage so acute that it proved impossible to solve. In the final months of the war in Europe, almost 2,000 Mustangs protected the American heavy bombers. Such a protective shield proved almost impossible for the Luftwaffe to penetrate. Bomber losses plummeted, and Germany's cities and industries were systematically devastated by the American strategic bombing campaign. When the war ended, the new jet fighters, like the P-80 and F-86, soon eclipsed the Mustang as America's premier air superiority fighter. But for a fleeting moment, the P-51 had become a king of the skies. But all too soon, the march of technology had bumped it from its throne. Within just a few years of the war's end, the Mustang had been relegated to second-line status. Altogether, about 15,000 P-51s had been built, but thousands were scrapped wholesale in the months following the end of the war. Others, a precious few, were sold off to racing pilots and enthusiasts. Today, the once mighty horde of Mustangs that conquered the skies of Europe has been reduced to less than 100 flying examples. Every year at air shows throughout the United States, these precious relics take to the air before crowds of thousands. The idea for the consolidated B-24 Liberator came in the late 1930s when the Army Air Corps realized the need for a long-range heavy bomber that would not only be a counterpart to the older B-17, but would surpass it in performance. Flying faster with a wider range and with more bombs to deliver to the target, many thought that the designers of the B-24 had succeeded in their quest to make a better bomber.
A lot of pilots didn't like the B-24, but I loved it. I just thought the B-24Ds and E's were just a real good airplane. You had to fly them. It wasn't like a 17. A 17, you know, was a floater. It was like a C-47 or such. It had a big wing, and the B-24 had what they called a Davis airfoil, which was a narrow wing. You had to have more speed for takeoff and landings, while the 17 landed at a lower speed and so forth. And the B-24 carried more bombs than the B-17 and was faster than the 17. But the B-24 was built during the war for the purpose, like the Liberty ships. They were just for the battle, and after the battle was over, they got rid of all the B-24s. But I liked the B-24. I felt comfortable in it.
Indeed, the plane attracted so much notice that by 1940, both the British and French had placed large orders for it. Called the LB-30 in RAF service, the bomber initially served with Coastal Command, where it hunted German U-boats in the Atlantic. In 1942, the first B-24D variants arrived to join operational U.S. AAF bomb groups. With a max speed of 300 miles per hour at 25,000 feet, the Liberator was some 20 to 30 miles per hour faster than the older B-17. Its four Pratt & Whitney R-1830 twin Wasp engines produced a total of 4,800 horsepower. 10 50 caliber machine guns protected it from enemy interceptors, while its mammoth bomb bays could hold up to 12,500 pounds of ordnance. At first glance, the B-24 appeared to be the ultimate strategic bomber, one with which the Army Air Force could crush Nazi Germany's industrial base. For all its assets, the B-24 had a number of very serious flaws that made it far less beloved by its crews than the B-17. Most serious, the Liberator could not take nearly the beating that the Flying Fortress could.
It seemed to me that about half of our missions, we had malfunctions of one type or another, either caused by the combat or sometimes just happened. Get halfway to the target, and one of the engines would go completely out. Oil would spurt out. No oil. Have to feather that engine and then turn around and come back rather than continue. So it was a problem, major problem, and they did everything they could to keep them going, but as I said before, they lost half of the planes that we had by the end of the war, one half. It's incredible.
While the B-24 wasn't exactly fragile, it certainly was not in the same league with the rugged, tough machine that Boeing produced. All too often, Liberator missions turned into tragic tales of death and destruction at the hands of enemy fighters. B-24 pilot Bill Foster recalls just such a mission over occupied Europe.
We lost an engine, and there were fighters around, but they weren't really attacking our squadron. But I don't know whether a stray bullet, maybe just a hose flew off or what, but we lost our oil pressure on one engine. And so we feathered the engine, and we just couldn't keep up. We fell back, and we were the last one with the photographer on board. Then we lost another engine, caught on fire, and the fighters were attacking. That's when they really came in from all sides. Then they had this ME-110, a twin-engine fighter with the rockets
I'd never seen a rocket or heard of one, but we could see them going by us, and they were the ones that really did all the damage. They hit our waist and killed 2 or 3 fellows in the back. They shot all our engines off, or they quit, and all of a sudden my rudder controls just went out. I had no control of that at all, and same way with the ailerons. So I yelled, "Let's go." We had to go up through the hatch, and we're lucky our airplane had that top hatch because they all didn't. It was only 2 foot square about, and that's where we went up, all of us on the flight deck. And just as I was standing there ready to go up, I see Pete, my navigator, coming up from the bomb bay, and I got up on top and helped him up, and we were the last 2 out of the airplane. My intention was to walk all the way back to the airplane on top of that fuselage and jump off the tail. But just as I started out, the plane lurched, and I fell down on the right wing and rolled off through the flames. The whole trailing edge of the right wing was on fire. And I rolled off through that, and I must have passed out because I don't remember pulling the chute. But I woke up, and I was being lifted up in the air by the chute opening. And the airplane was not too far off, and I saw it crash just, probably a city block from where we landed. One fellow, early in the mission, when we were first attacked, he had his foot blown off. And we issued morphine to him, or I had to give that to him. And we thought that he had been, when we counted the chutes, we thought he had been blown out. But we found out later that they threw him out, and he was alive when he went out. But he landed in a tree and bled to death. The tail gunner was killed in the turret. The ball turret down below, he was killed just getting out of his turret. I don't know how he knew, but the photographer told me that he took a rocket right in midsection. The worst one was the nose gunner, who had his turret over to one side. And it was shot out. The controls were shot out. The bombardier tried to wind him back in mechanically, and he couldn't do it. So he died screaming. He was in the airplane when I left.
Besides being less than durable, the B-24 with its narrow wing tended to wallow above 20,000 feet. This made it a mediocre bombing platform and made tight defensive formations above that altitude impossible to fly.
Controls are very mushy on a B-24, extremely mushy. That means when you're flying in tight formation, you're constantly moving throttles and the rudders and the ailerons all the time, just continually moving them. It was hard work. After we worked 15 minutes apiece, the pilot, 2 pilots, and after 15 minutes, you're ready for a rest.
Never loved like the B-17, the Liberator would nonetheless provide yeoman service in the U.S. Army Air Force. Never flashy, but always capable of getting the job done, the B-24 equipped the entire 3rd Air Division within the 8th Air Force. By mid-1944, the 15th Air Force in Europe flew B-24s almost exclusively. In the South Pacific, the B-17 initially served as the mainstay of the heavy bomb groups. By mid-1943, however, the B-17s were giving way to the longer-legged B-24s. Eventually, the Liberator entirely replaced the Flying Fortress in the Pacific. By war's end, the B-24 had been produced in greater numbers than any other American aircraft. No fewer than 18,482 Liberators rolled off of assembly lines throughout the United States, including the famous River Rouge plant in the Midwest. Both the Army, Air Force, and the Navy used the B-24 in a variety of roles, a fact which made it more versatile, if not more respected, than the B-17. Liberators were employed as high and low altitude bombers, night intruders, skip bombers, transport aircraft, and for long-range maritime patrol missions. Few aircraft in American history have been adapted for as many uses as the B-24. Its very versatility made it one of the great designs of World War II. With the end of the war, the B-24 disappeared from American service with surprising speed. Liberators in Europe were lined up by the hundreds in fields across England and Germany where they were summarily scrapped. The few that returned to the United States were quickly mothballed in aircraft boneyards in Arizona and Southern California. By late 1946, hardly a B-24 remained in flying condition. While the B-24 Liberator outnumbered all other American heavy bombers of World War II, its key role in the air campaigns against Germany and Japan has been eclipsed by the more popular and beloved Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. Never a plane to generate much passion with its crews, the B-24 nonetheless formed the backbone of the 15th, 13th, 5th, and 7th Air Forces and flew on some of the most important missions of the war. Liberators dropped more bombs than any other American heavy bomber during the war, doing so while taking heavy losses from flak and fighters. Though it never became a true legend in aviation history, as did the B-17 and the B-29, the Liberator served as the Army Air Force's most versatile workhorse. Said one Liberator pilot, "It was good enough to get the job done." In 1939, no air force in the world was larger or more modern than Germany's Luftwaffe. Built almost from scratch over the previous 6 years, Germany's Air Force had the best planes, the best equipment, and its pilots were considered the elite of Hitler's armed forces. Their mission was simple: bring the war to the enemy through terror, tactical support, and Army cooperation. The core of the new Air Force consisted of the dive bomber groups, the dreaded Stukas, and the level bombers, such as the Heinkel 111 and the Dornier 17. Through their pinpoint accuracy, the Stuka could sow destruction upon troop concentrations, bunkers, pillboxes, forts, and other tactical targets. While the dive bombers worked closely with the Wehrmacht, the Heinkels and Dorniers would rain bombs down on the rear areas, blowing up bridges, railheads, road intersections, and airfields. Reich Marshal Hermann Goering, an unpopular World War I fighter pilot who had become one of Hitler's earliest lackeys, commanded the Luftwaffe with a capriciousness that drove his operational level officers to utter helpless frustration. In the 1930s, Goering's vision of the Luftwaffe had been simplistic and dangerously unrealistic. Basically, he wanted airplanes and lots of them. When proponents of long-range strategic bombing tried to convince the Reichsmarschall to order the production of 4-engine bombers that could carry out the task, Goering refused. 4-engine bombers would take up too much material, he argued, so fewer planes would be produced. He wanted numbers, not strategic bombers, and he could have twice as many twin-engine planes as 4-engine ones for the same cost. The decision would have serious consequences later when his twin-engine fall, the Luftwaffe.
We never saw anything in the papers about our planes being shut down. And if there were, the number was always so minimal as we were just winning. There was nothing else but winning.
And then a new and far more deadly threat arrived, one that would ultimately doom the Luftwaffe, the United States Army Air Force. In the summer of 1943, the American strategic bombing campaign began in earnest. To stop the B-17s and B-24s, the Reich would rely on 4 main types of fighters: 2 single-engined and 2 twin engines. The single-engine fighter groups flew either the Messerschmitt Bf-109G or the Focke-Wulf 190A. The Bf-109 and FW-190 were designed to be air superiority weapons. Their main purpose, as envisioned in 1939, was to clear the skies of enemy fighters so the Luftwaffe's bombers could do their work. Neither had been built to intercept enemy bombers. When the American B-17s and B-24s began appearing in Europe's skies, both German fighters showed weaknesses in their new role as interceptors. Still, the 109 had speed. At 28,540 feet, the Bf-109G2, with its liquid-cooled 1,475 horsepower Daimler-Benz engine, could just touch 406 miles per hour. It could also race to altitude quickly, an essential asset for any aircraft used as an interceptor. From sea level, it could climb to 20,000 feet in just over 5 minutes. While it could get to the bombers quickly, the 109 could not loiter. It carried enough fuel to stay aloft for only about an hour and a half. Size was another of the 109's assets. With a length of 29 feet and a wingspan of 32 feet, the Messerschmitt had a narrow fuselage and stubby, narrow wings that made it a difficult target in the air. Where the 109 was fragile and fussy, the Focke-Wulf was lean and tough. Operational by 1941, the FW-190 quickly proved to be far superior to any Allied fighter of the day. At low altitude, it could outrun anything in the air, including the British Spitfire Mark V. With its phenomenal rate of roll, it could flip over into a split S far quicker than its enemies. Focke-Wulf pilots frequently used the split S to escape from stern attacks as a result. Not until the arrival of the P-51B did the Allies have a fighter equal to the FW-190. Rugged and well-armed, the 190A became the premier fighter in Western Europe throughout the next 2 years. Later versions of the 190A, which had a wingspan of 34 feet and a length of 29 feet, could carry up to 8 20-millimeter cannon, 4 in the wings, 4 in external gondolas. Such firepower had fearsome effects on Allied bombers. At low altitude, the Focke-Wulf's air-cooled 1,700 horsepower BMW engine could drive the fighter along at about 315 miles per hour. That was fast enough to outrun any Allied fighter of the day on the deck. It reached its optimum max speed at 21,000 feet, where it could sustain 418 miles per hour for short periods. If it had a weakness, it was its high-altitude performance. Above 25,000 feet, the 190 became sluggish at the controls. At any altitude, it couldn't outturn the Spitfire or the P-51, while above 25,000 feet, the P-47 Thunderbolt could turn in sight, as could the P-38L. Turning fights at high altitude usually ended in disaster for the German pilot foolish enough to get into that situation. The remaining defenders of the Reich in 1943 were the twin-engine heavy fighters, the Messerschmitt 110 and Messerschmitt 410. These aircraft carried awesome arrays of firepower, 20-millimeter, 30-millimeter, even 75-millimeter cannon, heavy machine guns, and even GR-21 rockets. When American fighters began appearing over Germany, the day of the 110 and 410 came to an end. Neither could stay in the air against the P-47, P-38, or P-51, and they were slaughtered wholesale. Eventually, they were withdrawn and used only as night fighters. The first 6 months of 1944 saw the tide turn permanently against the defenders of the Reich. With its fighter units on their last legs, the Luftwaffe pinned its hopes on a new wonder weapon, the Messerschmitt 262. As the world's first jet fighter, the Me-262 was supposed to revolutionize the air war over Europe and wrest control of the skies away from the Allies one final time. Powered by two Junkers Jumo turbojet engines, the Me-262 could reach 540 miles per hour, over 100 miles per hour faster than any Allied fighter then deployed. With its four 30-millimeter cannon, it could tear apart a bomber with a single short burst. And with a wingspan of 40 feet and a length, Luftwaffe hoped the 262 would be its savior. The new jet fighter had too many problems to be an effective answer to the Allied bombing campaign. With the war's end, the Luftwaffe ceased to exist. Though they fought bravely, even suicidally, the defenders of the Reich had failed to save their nation from total destruction. Though once thousands strong, only a few of Germany's great aircraft survived in the post-war world. Thousands lay alongside runways, nothing but twisted wreckage gathering weeds as they slowly rusted away. By 1950, the Luftwaffe's fighter force existed only in old photos and in the memories of those men who, despite telling odds, rose to do battle time and again in a cause as hopeless as it was perverted. They were the defenders of the Reich.